So, hello and welcome to our webinar Strategies and Guidance regarding computer implemented inventions at the EPO. I'm Kira from Management Circle and your host for today's webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to contact me via chat, but first let's have a look at our schedule. So, what is happening during the next 60 minutes? We're going to have enough time for your question. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write it into the chat so that I can ask it to the speaker after the webinar. Also, we plan a question and answer session at the end of the lecture. So you can find the chat in the menu of the GoToWebinar platform. On the right side here, you can see a panel which has folded. You can reopen it by clicking on the orange arrow, and you can also find on the right side of your screen. So this webinar is part of the IP Service World, which will take place next year on the 22nd and 23rd of November 2021 in Munich. This part is also one part of the IP Service World Academy. So if you like to have a certificate of this, you have to watch all the 3 webinars. So there are 2 further webinars next week and the week after. If you watch them all 3, you can get a certificate from Management Circle. Please just contact us and we will send it to you immediately. So now I'm happy to introduce you to Mr. Peter Reckenthaler, our speakers for today's webinar. I wish you all a great and very informative time. So, Mr. Reckenthaler, you can start now.
So thank you, Kira, very much for the introduction and for letting me speak today about strategies and guidance regarding computer implemented inventions at the EPO.
We see the white screen, thank you.
The slides, perfect. Thank you very much. So before going into detail, let me briefly give you an overview over what we are going to look at in today's talk. Firstly, I'll give you a short intro into the basics of computer implemented inventions, CIIs, starting with the 2-hurdle approach applied at the EPO. Then we'll have a look at how to overcome the first hurdle, technical character. After that, we'll have a look into what I consider to be a useful tool, a useful systematic approach to address CIIs, namely the Notional Business Person. And having done that, we'll look at the second hurdle. Do we find a technical effect? So let's first look at what is a computer implemented invention at the EPO. So as we probably all know, according to the European patent conventions, patents are granted for inventions in fields of technology. But, however, there shall not be a granted patent for programs for computers. So this appears as if software is excluded from patentability. Luckily, we have the guidelines for examinations at the EPO, which give us a bit more insight. So it's true that computer programs as such are excluded from patentability, but the exclusion does not apply to computer programs having a technical character. So here we are with our computer implemented inventions, which according to the guidelines, the EPO guidelines, are defined as such inventions that involve use of a computer or a programmable apparatus where at least a feature is realized by means of a computer program. So this brings us directly to the 2 hurdles of patentability that apply in case of a computer implemented inventions. To be granted as a European patent, a computer-implemented invention must have technical character and must not be excluded from patentability as such. That's what we call the first hurdle, determining of technical character. Now, in addition, also a computer-implemented invention has to fulfill the requirements that all inventions at the EPO have to fulfill to be granted. It has to be new, and it has to be inventive. That's then what we call the second hurdle. So let's briefly look at the first hurdle. In principle, the first hurdle is an easy to overcome requirement. It's an absolute requirement, meaning it is looked at not comparing a claim to the prior art, but just looking at the claim as it is. And thereby, a single feature is sufficient to render a whole claim patentable. We have the possibility of mixed inventions, which was introduced into by the famous COMBIC decision of 2002. I displayed the head note here, which says that an invention consisting of a mixture of technical and non-technical features is possible, and the inventive step is assessed taking into account those features that contribute to the technical character. And a further important information is that if we have an aim to be achieved in a non-technical field, this aim may then appear as part of the formulation of the problem in the framework of the problem and solution approach. So we have no definition of what is technical in the EPC, but we have now established case law according to which specific apparatus such as computers, networks, computer readable media, and so on have technical character per se, and method claims are technical if they make use of such specific technical means. Now, in principle, as I said, this hurdle is straightforward to be overcome, but it should also not be forgotten. We have here a very recent example. This case was decided in September 2020, where the application concerned a mathematical method for solving a multidimensional optimization problem. And the application states in its introduction relatively generically that such optimization problems are very important in many economical and technical domains, but then remains rather generic. And the claim that we see here is directed to a method, and it includes steps of calculating certain values, calculating further values, calculating a standard deviation of values, normalization of something, and it keeps going like that. And in this extreme case, as the application as a whole did not include any further disclosure on such method being computer implemented, this case was decided to be excluded from patentability. Its subject matter is not regarded as an invention pursuant to Article 52.1 EPC in combination with the article we looked at. So this is an extreme case, but we can learn from this case, even though the first hurdle is in principle simple to be overcome by defining the claim subject matter to be computer implemented or performed by an apparatus or implemented on a computer system. It should not be forgotten. because applications can be refused also based on the first hurdle. And now that's honestly the hurdle that's probably in practice of more relevance. Usually the first hurdle is no problem because usually the claims do include at least one, even if it's generic, at least one feature such as an apparatus or computer implemented. So the second hurdle is where most of the discussions are carried out when discussing, for example, applications with the examiners at the EPO. So having a claim directed to a computer implemented invention, only the technical features of the claim contribute to patentability. And as we learned, features without a technical effect, they may be used in the formulation of the problem the invention seeks to solve. So how do we then apply in practice the problem and solution approach to computer implemented inventions? We compare the claim with the prior art. And the simple case, if no feature is new, we have a standard lack of novelty and the claim is just rejected as being not new. If we have distinguishing features that are not disclosed in the prior art, but that are non-technical, that do not solve a technical problem, then the whole claim is new, but it does not solve a technical problem and therefore lacks an inventive step. And the interesting constellation is if we have distinguishing features that have a technical effect, then we proceed as we usually do with the problem and solution approach. We determine an objective technical problem and determine whether or not the prior art as a whole includes any hint that would have guided a skilled person towards the subject matter defined in the claim. So this shows that on the one hand, a clear differentiation between technical and non-technical features is crucial, but arguably not always trivial. And in practice, and according to my experience, the second hurdle, and because of the differentiation or arguments on the differentiation between technical and non-technical features, the second hurdle often leads to a premature refusal in examination proceedings. So now this brings us to the next chapter, where we look at the notional business person and how the notional business person may help us to address this problem. So we will look into decision T1463-11, which introduced the notional business person, and we'll look at the claim underlying the decision as filed. I do not want you to read the whole claim. I just want to show you here we have a claim direct to a method, a system for supporting authentication processing of a commercial transaction between a merchant and a customer. For example, on a customer's web page, where on a merchant's web page, where a customer may want to select a product and purchase the product. So the claim directed to this system included, I exemplarily highlighted certain features in green, which I at least would consider to be technical on the first side. So we have a communications network, we have a plurality of different types of payment instruments. These payment instruments are enrolled or not enrolled in an authentication program. The program conforms to one of a plurality of authentication protocols. Then the claim defines a connection layer for interworking between merchant and customer. We have a plug-in layer with a plurality of plugin components, and here each plugin administers a different one of the authentication programs. We have a further distribution layer which routes communications and so on. So we have, in my opinion, a relatively large number of technical features that interwork with each other, even though the claim is, of course, set up in the field of e-commerce. So the examining division, when looking at the claim, acknowledged that we have technical features. So the first hurdle was no problem. The examining division acknowledged the claim to include a communication network, software layers, and software components. But the examining division argued that the application would allegedly not disclose any features that would go beyond, in a technical sense, beyond the use of a general purpose computer, and regarded a general purpose computer therefore as closest prior art. And then the remaining aspects were treated as being non-technical, so that the implementation of the scheme was then considered to be an obvious automation which a skilled person would have done without being inventive. So it's true that, as usual, the claim as filed was, even though it defined a number of technical features, maybe defined in a broad sense, but the examining division, in my opinion, completely ignored any kind of interworking between these technical features, but argued on a very generic basis. And in particular, failed to deterministically or in a structured manner compare the claim to a prior art example. And fortunately, the Board of Appeal saw this in a similar way. Before going into the details of the decision, let's briefly look at the application in a bit more detail. So as mentioned, the background is authentication of transactions between a customer and a merchant. And the figure depicted here is what the application referred to as prior art, from which the development disclosed started. We have a consumer, card holder at this point. We have a merchant server, the merchant server including a plugin. So in the description, this merchant server was required to hold or to implement a plurality of plugins, where each plugin was provided for a certain type of payment. For example, different types of payments may involve different types of credit cards or bank cards or different ways of electronic payment. And these plugins, small programs that were installed at the merchant server, allowed communication of the customer via his or her card, the merchant server, and an authentication server. So starting from this, the application recognized a problem to be that the merchant was faced with the burden to hold available a plurality of such plugin programs that had to be maintained, that had to be kept with the newest standard, and that consumed storage space, and so on and so on. In order to solve this problem, the application then suggested to provide an additional server or server system, which is depicted here, which holds the plurality of plugins. Here you see a Visa plugin, a MasterCard plugin, or other plugins that are hosted on this external server. And the merchant server only has to host a thin client, which is just a small piece of software which is easy to maintain, easy to hold up to date, easy to update, and which requires less storage space. So In terms of the application, the disputed feature is that the application proposed as opposed to the prior art, software plugins that authenticate transactions of respective merchant servers. They are implemented at a single server for transaction processing. So in view of corresponding explanations by the applicant in this sense and claim amendments, the examining division still found that the problem solved by the invention of how to outsource the authentication of a commercial transaction was an administrative or business activity. So the examining division did not acknowledge any technicality to be involved in this. And the applicant argued not really with this argument, but the applicant argued there was a prejudice against this thinking such that the business person would not have formulated the problem. And the Board of Appeal said both approaches are too simplistic, as they did not sufficiently precisely distinguish between technical and non-technical aspects of the application. So also the applicant's arguments himself were too simplistic. The Board of Appeal then introduced the notional business person as a means to better distinguish these features. And the notional business person is a fictional person very similar to the person skilled in the art, or corresponding to the person skilled in the art. It's a fictional person that on the one hand is a Superman in terms of business requirements. The notional business person knows everything about business and can of course formulate problems that are completely against what every other business person would have considered to be possible. So a prejudice in the business world is not a problem for the notional business person. But then at the same time, because he's corresponding to the person skilled in the art, he's completely ignorant of any technical aspect. He does not require use of the internet, require the use of wireless devices, of processors, of electricity all the time. The Board of Appeal argues that this, in line with the convict principle, ensures that all the technical matter, this is taken from the decision, even notorious matter is considered for obviousness and can contribute to the inventive step. Summarizing, the notional business person is a fictional character corresponding to the person skilled in the art, incapable of any technical consideration, but fully free to suggest any business requirement. So having defined this fictional character, the Board of Appeal looked again at the case and argued that the notional business person may realize that the fact that every merchant has to host its own plugins, the notional business person may realize that all the merchants have to hold large storage devices, that these are, he wouldn't be aware of the storage device, but he would be aware of the costs involved in such storage devices. He would realize there's always a lot of cost and complexity of operation when the merchant server is to be operated. But he's not aware of the fact that plugins are installed at the servers. And he's not aware of what could be achieved by moving those plugins to any other server. At the same time, of course, the skilled person, as we know him, is aware of plugins, is aware of servers, and is aware of technical implications when moving plugins from one server to the other. So the important part is the Board of Appeal formulated the objective technical problem as how to simplify installation maintenance of plugins at various servers, and importantly argued that the concept of centralization, of taking the plugins from all the different servers into one server, that must not be included into the objective technical problem. This is not, as the examining division argued when saying outsourcing of the plugins, this is not a purely administrative purpose, but a technical consideration. And then the question is this inventive? Is the solution to centralize the plugins in view of the problem how to simplify installation, maintenance of plugins at various servers? Is that an invention? And the skilled person, the Board of Appeal, in its decision, you can see that there were a lot of cons, a lot of arguments against inventive step, which are discussed by the Board of Appeal. But then in the end, the prejudice, which was actually proven by the applicant by means of witnesses, turned the Board of Appeal towards acknowledging, in view of this prejudice, even if the argument was that there was a business prejudice, the Board of Appeal saw, okay, there's a prejudice which may have implications also on the technical implementation, and in view of this prejudice, the Board of Appeal acknowledged an inventive step and granted the application. So this decision is from 2016, and if I may have succeeded in making this an interesting decision for you, I recommend actually that you take a look at the decision itself, because in my opinion, this is one of the best written decisions. It's written more or less like a book, an instructions, and I enjoyed reading that, and I think it's very nice and informative if you're interested. So it's not very old, but there is a very new decision from April 3rd, 2020, which also makes use of the notional business person, again in the field of e-commerce. And I would like to briefly also look at this decision, because it may further help to clarify this concept. So the application underlying decision 174914 was in the field of point of sale terminals. Point of sale terminals, we all use point of sale terminals when we go to a shop and we use our bank card or credit card for payment. The merchant will hand us his point of sale terminal, and we can use our credit card, contactless even nowadays, or in whichever, like swiping it through a corresponding channel, to introduce our banking information, and then we are required to type in a security PIN or the like, or at least to make a signature. And in this way, our payment is arranged. The application regarded such way of payment organization disadvantageous, as we have to use the merchant's installments, the merchant's internet connection, the merchant's devices, the merchant's hardwire connections, which may open doors of fraud where our data may be stolen by a third party. And in view of this, did not consider this standard approach to be optimal. And in order to solve this problem, the application suggested use of a terminal that is depicted here, which consists of two parts. One part is a standard smartphone, which can be introduced into such sleeve, which is owned by the customer. It's not owned by the merchant, but it's owned by the customer. It has this slot which can receive a mobile device, And it has this channel where we can swipe a magnetic card as we know it through. So based on this apparatus, the solution according to the application is that the customer brings his own terminal to the shop. The merchant also has his own point of sale terminal. And once the customer selects an item to shop, to buy, the merchant then swipes his card through the channel to provide his information to the customer. So the solutions in the complete solution suggested by the application is that the separate customer point of sale terminal stores on the one hand encryption keys dedicated to the customer that are used for communication with a financial transaction verification entity. It stores the account information of the customer, and it allows the merchant to provide his account information to the customer's terminal, and then it allows both the customer information and the merchant information to be jointly transferred to the financial transaction verification entity. And then, based on this information, further procedures are then carried out between the merchant and the financial transaction verification entity to complete the transaction. So let's look at how the examining division looked at this case. This is claim 1 that was subject to the decision, with the portions highlighted in green that the examining division itself considered to be not known from the prior art. So we have a feature of storing the customer account information in the terminal. We have the feature of using this personalized terminal in the operations. And we have the feature of, once the customer account information are stored, it receives the merchant information, and that the account information, both of the merchant and of the customer, are provided jointly to the financial transaction verification entity. And the claim further explicitly recognizes or defines that there are the personalized encryption keys that are used, necessary for the communication between this customer device and this entity. So even though all these features were not disclosed in the prior art, the examining division argued that it would be the business expert that suggests the requirement of specifying an entry point for the transaction. So the examining division argues the fact that everything of importance is carried out at this point would be something suggested by the business person. And features 1 to 4, which are the features highlighted in green, would be cognitive business aspects, solving no technical problem. And then again, of course, once we're there, the implementation is straightforward and obvious to the skilled programmer. And fortunately, in my opinion, the Board of Appeal also disagreed with this view. According to the Board of Appeal, what we see here in this figure depicting the solution is not a straightforward implementation, but it shows that the claimed subject matter requires fundamental structural and functional modifications of a point of sale terminal as the one disclosed in the closest prior art. The Board of Appeal explicitly argued that dividing a point of sale terminal into these two entities, personalizing the customer part by storing encryption keys and the customer account information, and then the further feature of retrieving the merchant information and sending this to the financial transaction verification entity would not be something that the business person would suggest. Explicitly, this is taken from the decision, the notional business person might come up with the abstract idea of avoiding the customer to perform the actions that we just talked about, to type in his key at the shop and use his card with the merchant's system. But the fact that a fully new infrastructure is provided by Claim 1 shows that this is not anything the notional business person would have suggested, but this requires technical considerations that go beyond what the notional business person would have considered. And then the case was remitted to the first instance. As of today, the case is now back to examination, but the latest communication from the examining division now acknowledged Claim 1 to be novel and inventive, and only raised formal objections and required a further independent claim to be brought into conformity with Claim 1. So it looks like this application is going to be granted soon. So in conclusion, as we can take from these two exemplary cases, I think that the notional business person is an abstract tool that can help to very systematically structure a claim in terms of its technical and non-technical features. And it is in particular a tool that can be used when arguing based on an existing claim with the examining division doing prosecution. At the same time, I think that the business person may also be useful even before filing an application, at the stage when the invention is being made internally, or at least at the stage where the inventors and the patent attorneys sit together and think about how to formulate a claim or to draft an application, and to decide if the development, the software-based development, is already at a point where there's enough sufficient technical detail that is detail the notional business person would not have suggested, such that it's worth filing the application. And it can also be used at the stage before filing the application as a check, as a means of checking if the application actually provides sufficient technical details that a notional business person would not have thought about. So now we have identified the features that are technical in a claim, and we can formulate an objective technical problem. We're now at the stage where we can try to overcome the second hurdle. So here we'll look at an application in the field of artificial intelligence in view of a decision, an interesting decision, which came out recently. So before going into the application, let me quickly give you some further details or basics on this particular field of computer implemented invention. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we often, in particular in the case we're going to look at, talking about neural networks and machine learning. A neural network, for example, being a computational model which consists of one or more layers of nodes, the nodes being connected by corresponding connections. And this computational system being designed for a specific case, structured for a specific case, can then be fed with training data, in which case we then know what the system should actually put out as solution, and we can tell the system if it processed correctly or wrongly. And based on such training data, we can train the system until it produces the results we want to have. And afterwards, we can then apply the system to the case we want to apply it. And the guidelines of examination already acknowledge artificial intelligence and machine learning and put them as being computational models and algorithms into the field of mathematical methods. And mathematical methods, again, as software, as programs for computers, are excluded as such from patentability, but can be subject to a granted application if the mathematical method in fact contributes to producing a technical effect that solves a technical purpose. So here are some examples that are in principle taken from the guidelines. I mean, the standard example is a control of a specific technical system where a mathematical algorithm, some threshold comparison or the like, is used to control a technical system, as a technical system in a car, which keeps the car in a lane or which helps the car to brake or so. Further standard cases of mathematical methods that can be basis for patented developments are in digital audio, image, or video processing, denoising, detecting persons in a digital image, estimating the quality, and so on and so on. Then encoding data, encrypting data for telecommunication, and so on. So these are all examples of mathematical methods that may, if correctly claimed, produce a technical effect that may form basis for inventive step of a claim at the EPO. So let's look into this decision, which is from May 2020. We are now in the field of medical devices. The application is directed to the problem of measuring blood pressure without being invasive. So prior art methods were, according to the application, in particular invasive methods, which should be avoided. And the aim is to provide a non-invasive method for determining the volume of blood being pumped by the heart, which is referred to as cardiac output. And the idea, because this cannot be directly measured at the heart, is to measure the peripheral blood pressure. And the problem is how to map, so to say, this measured pressure to the actual pressure out at the heart. And according to the application, it was already known in the art that a mapping can be done, but the methods known were complex and hard to implement. And the application sought in particular to provide an essentially handheld device, at least a small device that can be used at a doctor's office, I guess. So the solution, according to the patent, is depicted in principle here in this graph. So we have the measured blood pressure here, and we have a white box, which in the end turned out to be a black box, 8. So this is the artificial neural network, which maps the measured curve to the output central blood pressure curve. And then we have further calculations, optimization of the cardiac output and so on, and some optional calculations. So here is what the application discloses in terms of the training of the neural network. These are only 2 examples. There's not much more in the application. So the application says the weights of the nodes of the neural network are randomly initialized and then fed with input data generically. And then it says it is important that the input data covers a wide spectrum of possible input values and uses a bandwidth of potential properties and so on and so on. So one can see that the application is relatively generic and in particular does not provide a specific example of a training set or some more specific information on the training set. And it's maybe important to also note that the application also did not disclose further details on the neural network, how the neural network was designed for this purpose. It just disclosed a black box. And based thereon, the examining division looked at the prior art and found that the only distinguishing feature of the claim, so the claim being in German language, the translation taken from the US counterpart, the distinguishing feature was that the method, the claimed method, is performed by the aid of an artificial neural network whose weighting values are determined by learning. So also this feature is very generic and does not include any details. Based thereon, the examining division argued because the use of artificial neural networks were non-provision, the technical effect is just the provision of an alternative, and there was no inventive step acknowledged. And in this case, the Board of Appeal agreed, arguing with the applicant's statement that the neural network allowed for a precise and efficient calculation taking into account particular difficulties of the problem. The Board of Appeal argued that this argument cannot be followed because neither the application nor the claims do not provide any further detail how such effect can be used, so to say, over the whole range claimed, because the claim just fully generically uses an artificial neural network determined by learning. So this can be any artificial neural network designed for any purpose and using any kind of learning data. So because of that, the Board of Appeal said there will not be an inventive step acknowledged. It's important for completeness of this application to mention that the Board of Appeal even said there is a lack of sufficiency of disclosure because in their view, because there was no further detail in this respect, a skilled person would not be in a position to put the invention into practice. So it's probably disputable if this conclusion is too strict or not. It may be that a person skilled in the art in view of the setup, in view of the problem to measure blood pressure would in fact be in a position to provide some kind of neural network that would be suitable for solving this problem. The point which I consider important here, and which has importance not only for artificial intelligence, but in fact for any computer implemented invention, is that we should be sure when we think about filing applications, are we at a stage where we know sufficient detail on the development that we can put it into writing? And at the drafting stage, do we have sufficient technical detail in the application that we can disclose at least one way with specific information which can be taken from the application and not from site literature, that the claimed subject matter can be put into practice and actually has technical effect within the scope that is defined by the claim. I think that this point is important for many computer implemented inventions and developments. So, and this brings me already to the conclusions of this talk. So we have learned, hopefully, that computer implemented inventions, even though software is excluded from patentability, computer implemented inventions are patentable if the claimed subject matter provides an inventive contribution to the prior art, which means if we have a solution for a technical problem with technical means defined in the claim. And if we have sufficient basis and support in the application to support this inventive step. And in terms of deciding whether or not a claim or a development that is not yet subject to a claim has sufficient technical contribution, the notional business person may be a helpful tool before filing or during prosecution to distinguish technical and non-technical features of a claim or of a development. And again, in my view, a very important point for all computer implemented inventions, we should ensure that the application provides sufficient detail on how the claim subject matter is put into practice so that we can, on the one hand, support sufficiency of disclosure, but then that we can also support an inventive step when arguing with the EPO. So this brings me to the last slide where I thank you for your attention and where I hand over to our discussion round. If at the end there should be any questions, if there are any questions that are not answered during this talk, then please feel free to write me an email. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Peter. Now I'm here again, Kira from Management Circle, host of the webinar today. Thank you for the informative webinar. We have two questions from the participants, and I would like to read it for you. So the first question is, the discussed decisions are in the field of e-commerce. Can the concept of the notional business person be applied to different fields?
That's a very good question. I think, yes, I think the concept can be equally applied to different fields of computer implemented inventions. In particular, for example, if we are talking about a development in the field of graphical user interfaces, for example, we could think of a notional designer that designs such a graphical user interface. And if all the features defined in the claims could be suggested by the notional designer, then there's a chance that there is not an invention. But if we can distinguish features in the claim that go beyond the scope of such notional designer, for example, then there's a likelihood that we can convince the examining division of patentability.
Thank you for the answer. So we have a second question, which is, what makes a claim technical?
So what makes a claim technical? So this really goes back to the two-hurdle approach, I would say. So the first point is we have to identify at least one technical feature in the claim. We can have mixed claims where we have technical and non-technical features, but we have to specify at least one technical feature. We have to specify that a method is performed by an apparatus, for example. And then to be able to argue an inventive step, we have to show that the software-based development either produces a technical effect on the machine it's implemented on, so that we can argue that there is a technical effect on the machine itself, or that we have a technical solution for a technical problem outside of the machine, for example, as in the case of the decision introducing the Notional Business Person, where we, by means of the software-based development, were able to take the burden from the merchants of having to host the plurality of plugins at their own machines, and thereby simplifying their systems and reducing the burden for them.
So thank you. This was the last question, which was very interesting input. Well, that's my point from my side. Thank you very much for listening to today's webinar. We got a question to an invitation for the next 2 webinars. So you can find it on a link. I will share my screen again. So you can see on this website, you can find the other webinars. So you can just register for them and send us an email to get the certificate. That's from my side. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, all participants, for today's webinar. And have a great day, great evening. And now the last word goes to you.
I can also only say thank you very much again for listening. And if any further questions come up afterwards, again, please feel free to just write me an email. I will be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.